Muito boa noite. Primeiramente, muito boa noite a todos. Sejam muito bem-vindos. Estamos aqui no nosso prédio da FIPECAF, em São Paulo. São exatamente 19 horas e 10 minutos e daremos início, a partir de agora, à nossa Aula Magna 2022.2. Vou pedir somente a todos que, por gentileza, deixem os microfones mutados e, na sequência, à medida que nós formos chamando, vocês podem irem liberando o microfone, tá bem? Sejam todos muito bem-vindos. Nós gostaríamos de lembrá-los que este evento conta com tradução simultânea e você tem a possibilidade de escolher o idioma da sua preferência. Basta habilitar o recurso na barra inferior do seu aplicativo Zoom, que fica logo aqui na página, no momento central aqui da página, no canto inferior. Neste momento, iniciamos a nossa aula magna do segundo semestre de 2022, dando as boas-vindas aos nossos colaboradores, professores, alunos do curso de graduação, bacharelado e tecnólogos, MBA, pós-graduação e mestrado profissional que estão todos aqui presentes. Saudamos os alunos, coordenadores de cursos, professores e diretoria da FIPECAF. Estendemos os nossos cumprimentos às demais autoridades aqui presentes. A diretoria da FIPECAF, a diretoria da Faculdade de Economia, Administração e Contabilidade, FEA USP, professora Maria Dolores Montoya Dias. Ao chefe do Departamento de Contabilidade e Atuária da FEA USP, professor Valmor Slonsky. Ao presidente do Conselho Curador da FIPECAF, professor Reinaldo Guerreiro, e aos demais membros do Conselho Curador e do Conselho Fiscal da FIPECAF. Dando início à nossa aula magna, é com muita honra que apresento a nossa mesa diretora desta noite. O professor Edgar Cornacchione, diretor-presidente da FIPECAF, professor Fernando Dauri Múrcia, diretor de projetos da FIPECAF, professor João Domiraci Passês, diretor administrativo financeiro da FIPECAF, professor Anderson Braga de Aguiar, diretor de cursos da FIPECAF e diretor-geral da Faculdade FIPECAF. Professora Luciana Maia Campos Machado, superintendente acadêmica da Faculdade FIPECAF, e Arturo Rodrigues, líder de mercado sênior para Iberoamérica na Fundação IFRS, que é o nosso palestrante da noite. E eu convido agora, neste momento, o professor Edgar Cornacchione, diretor-presidente da FIPECAF, que é a Fundação Mantenedora da Faculdade FIPECAF, para falar em nome da diretoria executiva. Professor, a palavra é contigo.
Boa noite, Michael, muito obrigado. Quero inicialmente cumprimentar a todos os membros da mesa, em especial me dirigir ao presidente do Conselho Curador da FIPECAF, o professor Reinaldo Guerreiro, e também cumprimentar os nossos alunos, nossos professores, nossos colaboradores, né? Todos os participantes que estão aqui conosco nessa noite, né, que é um momento carregado de simbolismo, né, essa aula magna, para acolher os nossos ingressantes, né, e, em especial, aos ingressantes. A Faculdade FIPECAF merece a nossa admiração, em especial os participantes, né, da Faculdade FIPECAF, em especial os nossos professores, nossos colaboradores e os nossos alunos, né? Eu queria, muito brevemente, me dirigir a todos no início dessa aula magna, indicando que a FIPECAF está, nesse momento, completando 48 anos de fundação. É uma jovem, que eu costumo dizer, uma jovem de 48 anos, cheia de energia, né? E que a gente, nessa diretoria, a gente tem buscado orientar as ações da Fundação com base em 3 bandeiras estratégicas, né? A bandeira do alargamento do escopo, a bandeira da tecnologia e a bandeira da internacionalização. E quer um alinhamento mais perfeito do que esse, do que nessa nossa aula magna hoje, podemos contar com um representante internacional, né, ligado à Fundação IFRS, que vai nos brindar com a visão mais corrente, mais atual sobre os desenvolvimentos nessa frente. Lembrando a todas e todos que a FIPECAF ela é membro fundadora, né, membro instituidora do CPC aqui no Brasil, Comitê de Pronunciamentos Contábeis, e agora, mais recentemente, né, há 2 meses atrás, membro instituidora do CBPS, Comitê Brasileiro de Pronunciamento e Sustentabilidade, que é uma frente que o senhor Arturo Rodrigues já vem atuando com muita ênfase, né? Apenas para reforçar a minha fala inicial, a FIPECAF ela mantém a faculdade FIPECAF, que é quem está organizando, né, esse evento aqui hoje, e é um enorme orgulho a nossa faculdade que nos dá, né, em função da reputação que possui nos processos acadêmicos, né, processos de ensino, processos de pesquisa, ligados aos temas da área contábil, da área financeira, da área atuarial, né, em negócios de forma geral. Então, é nesse clima de enorme orgulho por conta da reputação que possui, né, e dos registros e dos alcances da nossa faculdade, que eu gostaria de brindar a todos e todas aqui, em especial, nesse momento, o professor Arturo Rodrigues, o senhor Arturo Rodrigues, que vai fazer essa menção especial, essa intervenção especial na nossa aula magna. Muito obrigado, devolvo a palavra.
Muito obrigado, professor. Nós que agradecemos. E neste momento, eu gostaria de chamar também o diretor de pesquisas da FIPECAF, o professor Fernando Dauri Múrcia, para algumas palavras. Professor, é contigo.
Obrigado, Michael. Boa noite formalmente a todos. Cumprimentar todos os presentes, a diretoria, os membros do conselho, toda a nossa comunidade, nossos colaboradores, nossos parceiros, nossos clientes, nossos alunos que estão ingressando, desejar boas-vindas, ótimo semestre para vocês, espero que estejam todos bem, ainda nesse final de pandemia Covid que a gente está vivendo, e só acho que ressaltar que eu acho que todos já sabem e receberam por e-mail, esse é o mês de aniversário da FIPECAF, né? Como o nosso presidente Edgar comentou agora, uma jovem aí de 48 anos, e eu sempre comento isso, e muita gente que está aqui, amigos aqui que estão aqui, já me ouviram falar, que a FIPECAF, na verdade, são pessoas, né? Uma instituição de prestação de serviços, como a gente educacional, e mais na minha área de projetos e consultoria, são as pessoas que fazem isso. O nosso principal ativo realmente são as pessoas, esse ativo intangível, esse capital intelectual. Então, acho que é um momento também sempre de celebração, de se reunir aqui em conjunto, todos, agradecer a parceria de toda essa comunidade, desse momento que a gente viveu e está vivendo ainda, esse reta final, e então é muito bom contar com todos vocês. Queria agradecer ao Arturo, que é o nosso palestrante hoje, ele vai dar maiores detalhes, mas vocês sabem que essa questão de ESG realmente tomou uma proporção muito grande no mundo e no Brasil também. A FIPECAF, como vocês sabem, além de membro do CPC, do Comitê de Pronunciamentos Contábeis, a gente é membro e vai ser membro também do órgão que está sendo criado, que é o CBPS, que é o Comitê Brasileiro de Pronunciamentos e Sustentabilidade, que vai fazer essa correlação com o ISSB, o órgão internacional, assim como o CPC faz com o IFRS. Então, a gente vai estar envolvido também nessa parte de normatização, além de todos essa questão de cursos, consultorias, todos esses serviços que a gente provê. Tá? Então, eu acho que a palestra do Arturo vem em muito boa hora, dada a relevância desse tema, queria agradecê-lo. E por fim, dizer que a gente está de portas abertas aqui, a área de projetos e pesquisas também, para os novos alunos, para os professores, para conhecer um pouco do nosso trabalho. Nós temos iniciativas de divulgação, de boletim do Denários, temos nossos laboratórios de pesquisa, e para quem tiver interesse em trabalhar com projetos, com consultoria, ou indicar clientes, indicar parceiros, nós estamos à disposição. Tá? Agradeço novamente aí, uma ótima palestra a todos, e retorno com você, Marco, a palavra. Obrigado.
Muito obrigado, professor. E agora eu passo a palavra ao nosso diretor administrativo financeiro aqui da FPCAF, o professor João Domiraci Passes. É contigo, professor.
Obrigado, Michael. Boa noite a todas e a todos aqui presentes, nossos professores, coordenadores, parceiros, membros do conselho. Em especial, uma boa noite ao Arturo, nosso palestrante de hoje. Eu quero simplesmente dar as boas-vindas aos ingressantes e desejar que todos tenham muito sucesso nesta nova trajetória. Nós, aqui na FPCAF, vamos exercer todos os esforços possíveis para que vocês possam aproveitar ao máximo esse período de convivência e que adquiram novos conhecimentos e, após o final do curso, possam sair daqui pessoas mais elevadas, melhores não somente em termos de conhecimento, mas que, através do convívio com outras pessoas, possamos adquirir novas ideias e novas maneiras de viver. Sejam bem-vindos e até qualquer momento. Michael, devolvo para vocês.
Muito obrigado, professor João. E, neste momento, eu passo a palavra ao diretor de cursos aqui da FPCAF e o diretor-geral da instituição, professor Anderson Braga de Aguiar.
Obrigado, Michael, e boa noite a todos, boa noite a todas. Quero, acompanhar os demais membros da diretoria e dar as boas-vindas a todos, a todas que estão aqui participando desse evento, um evento bastante importante da faculdade, que marca o início das atividades do semestre. Então, quero dar especialmente as boas-vindas aos ingressantes, que estão ou se aproximando ou se reaproximando da faculdade FPCAF, que possam, ao longo desse período, ter a melhor experiência possível junto com a gente. Então, para a gente é um grande prazer, um grande privilégio estar recebendo cada um de vocês a partir desse momento. Quero agradecer ao Arturo, por ter aceito o convite, por estar junto aqui da gente nesse momento tão importante e especialmente em razão do tema e da relevância que ele tem ganho dentro do nosso ambiente. Gostaria de aproveitar, na linha do que o professor Edgar comentou, das bandeiras que têm sido buscadas na instituição e de modo semelhante na faculdade, destacar alguns pontos. Então, uma das bandeiras que foi colocada é a questão do aumento de escopo, e esse tema é um tema que, embora tenha uma relação com a contabilidade, ele vai além. Então, ele, no nosso entendimento, vai bastante associado com essa perspectiva, e a gente tem buscado, por meio dos nossos cursos, procurar dar uma atenção a esse tema já desde esse primeiro momento, como o caso do nosso MBA de FRS, que desenvolveu um módulo, um novo módulo específico para tratar desse tema, para promover o tema de ESG dentro da matriz curricular. Da mesma maneira, o nosso mestrado profissional, que vem procurando dar atenção a esse tema como um tema de pesquisa, para se desenvolver. Apenas para citar, então, 2 exemplos do que a gente vem procurando desenvolver associado a esse tema dentro dessa perspectiva de aumento de escopo. E ainda, nessa mesma perspectiva, o olhar que a gente tem procurado dar cada vez mais para cursos EAD, como a gente já tem os cursos de gestão tributária e FRS, e agora com o MBA Controller nessa mesma modalidade. Destacar também o papel da tecnologia que a gente vem procurando desenvolver ao longo dos vários programas que a gente oferece e pensando tanto sobre o ponto de vista do impacto que esse tema tem na profissão, em especial em relação à discussão sobre desenvolvimento de soft skills, né, e como que a gente vem procurando trabalhar isso também ao longo dos nossos programas, além dos temas, né, que estão bastante associados a essa discussão de tecnologia, como Big Data, Data Analytics, né, e temas correlatos. E gostaria ainda de destacar a questão da internacionalização, e como já foi colocado pelo professor Edgar, essa palestra é bastante simbólica em relação a essa iniciativa. Temos aqui o Arturo, né, representando a Fundação IFRS, e temos ainda outras iniciativas nessa mesma direção, que eu destacaria, né, uma parceria atual que a gente vem desenvolvendo com o ISCT de Portugal, né, no oferecimento de um curso de curta duração de FP&A. Então, são iniciativas que a gente vem procurando, apenas destacando algumas delas, alinhadas, né, com essa perspectiva de posicionamento da faculdade, não é? Junto com a instituição, junto com a Fundação FIPECAF. Então, queria mais uma vez dar as boas-vindas a cada um de vocês, não é? Que vocês possam aproveitar esse período junto com a faculdade, junto com a FIPECAF, não apenas na faculdade, mas como o Fernando comentou, as iniciativas junto com a área de projetos, né, e diversas possibilidades e experiências que a gente espera poder, né, oferecer a vocês ao longo desse processo. Muito obrigado.
Muito obrigado, professor. E eu convido neste momento a professora Luciana Maio Campos Machado, superintendente acadêmica da Faculdade FIPECAF, para algumas palavras. Professora, é contigo.
Obrigada, Michael. Boa noite a todos. Sejam muito bem-vindos. Gostaria de iniciar saudando os alunos, coordenadores, professores, a diretoria da Fundação, os membros do Conselho Curador, todas as autoridades que se juntaram a nós na noite de hoje, e em especial ao palestrante, o Arturo Rodrigues, que aceitou gentilmente o nosso convite para a Aula Magna desse semestre. O evento de hoje, ele é sempre muito importante, né, para nós. A Aula Magna marca o início de um relacionamento entre a Faculdade FIPECAF e alunos que confiaram em nós quando decidiram buscar atualização e troca de conhecimento, especialmente nesse momento que é de muita mudança no cenário da educação, e de como nós aprendemos e interagimos em um mundo que passou a ser mais digital do que nunca nesse contexto pós-pandemia. Todos nós temos vivenciado isso fortemente. E eu gostaria muito que vocês soubessem que passam a integrar agora a comunidade FIPECAF e a construir conosco uma história de excelência que a faculdade vem se propondo a trazer para o mercado. A faculdade FIPECAF lidera a discussão de temas contábeis, temas financeiros, de negócios, se posicionando nacional e internacionalmente. Isso vai em linha a uma das bandeiras que a gente levanta, a professora Anderson e o professor Edgar colocaram, que é a de internacionalização. E todas as nossas iniciativas, vocês vão poder vivenciar e ver dentro da faculdade, assim como os nossos cursos, os projetos pedagógicos que são desenhados, eles são construídos pensando em caminhar lado a lado com a evolução tecnológica e a inovação que a gente vivencia. E é nesse contexto que hoje a gente se propõe a discutir a definição dos padrões de divulgação relacionados à sustentabilidade e quais são os impactos que se tem para os profissionais da área de negócios. Esse é um tema que tem sido de grande destaque nas organizações atualmente. E em linha a essa liderança que a FIPECAF possui, a gente faz parte, a Fundação faz parte do Comitê Brasileiro de Pronunciamento e Sustentabilidade, como foi colocado previamente pelo professor Múrcia, pelo professor Edgar, que é um comitê que vai interagir com a ISSB, vai preparar esses pronunciamentos técnicos. Então, mais uma vez, a FIPECAF criando conhecimento, e é por isso que a gente pensou nessa palestra de hoje. Tenho certeza que vai ser muito valiosa para todos nós. E esse ambiente de liderança, de construção de conhecimento, ele nos permite uma avaliação de que é referência de qualidade frente ao MEC e que nos posiciona entre as melhores instituições de educação superior no Brasil. É importante que vocês que hoje se juntam à FIPECAF, a comunidade FIPECAF, saibam disso. A gente acumula notas máximas no índice geral de cursos desde 2016. São somente 4 faculdades privadas no estado de São Paulo que têm o GC5 desde 2016. E quando a gente olha para o Brasil todo, são apenas 10 faculdades privadas que mantiveram esse resultado desde esse período, então desde 2016. Na última divulgação desse índice, são só 2% das instituições de ensino superior no Brasil que estão posicionadas como nós estamos. Então, tenho certeza que vocês estão se juntando a um ambiente de excelência e vão fazer parte disso a partir de agora. Na mesma toada, os cursos de graduação são avaliados com nota máxima no MEC, nos processos de autorização e de reconhecimento, isso tanto na modalidade presencial quanto à distância. Então, eu fico muito feliz em tê-los aqui hoje. Deixo o meu muito obrigada por confiarem em nós. Eu desejo que seja o início de um semestre de muito aprendizado, muita superação e evolução profissional e pessoal para todos nós. Sejam muito bem-vindos e uma excelente aula magna a todos. Maico, obrigada. Devolvo a palavra para você.
Muito obrigado, Luciana. Nós que agradecemos. E a partir de agora, nós passaremos aqui através da nossa live, né, da nossa aula magna, slides com informações sobre a equipe de coordenadores e advisors da Faculdade FIPECAF. Perfeito, nós podemos acompanhar um pouquinho os responsáveis, a nossa equipe de administração de todas as áreas, de todos os cursos, né, os eixos de cursos que nós ofertamos aqui na FIPECAF. E nesse momento, eu passo a palavra ao professor Anderson Braga de Aguiar, que tem um convite muito importante, uma apresentação muito importante para fazer neste momento. Professor, é contigo.
Obrigado, Michael. Então, acho que esse momento é o momento mais importante, não é, dessa cerimônia, desse evento, que é chegarmos no momento em que o Arturo vai proferir a palestra. Então, eu gostaria de seguir a cerimônia com a apresentação, não é, da nossa aula magna desse segundo semestre de 2022 e tendo, não é, o Arturo com a inserção internacional por meio da Fundação IFRS, reforçando justamente esse compromisso que a faculdade tem com a busca, não é, por essa inserção internacional. Então, o Arturo tem mais de 15 anos de experiência trabalhando com o tema, né, de sustentabilidade, sendo atualmente líder de mercado sênior para Iberoamérica na Fundação IFRS. E nesse papel, nessa posição, o Arturo vem desenvolvendo esforços, vem liderando esforços, não é, na região, com o intuito de conscientizar empresas, investidores, reguladores, enfim, diversos atores que atuam no mercado de capitais, sobre as normas de sustentabilidade, né, vinculadas ao IFRS do International Sustainability Standards Board, o ISSB. E ele atualmente, né, atuando no México, então falando diretamente aqui da cidade do México, eu suponho, né? Então queria mais uma vez cumprimentar o Arturo, agradecer, não é, por ter aceito o nosso convite, de estar junto aqui com a gente e deixá-lo à vontade, então, para que nos dê não é, essa oportunidade de ouvi-lo sobre o tema. Muito obrigado, Arturo.
Thank you very much, Anson. Thank you very much to FIPECAF also, Edgar, Fernando, Luciana. Thank you for your words and for the opportunity to be here and being able to speak to your new and old students about a very important topic in the world of accounting and in the world of sustainability. First, apologies that I have to speak in English. I swear that I downloaded Duolingo, the language app, and I'm learning my Portuguese, but I don't feel confident yet to give a presentation, a full presentation in Portuguese. So you will have to do this I'll have to do this in English, and you'll have to listen to me through the translation. But again, I'm working on it. So thank you very much for the opportunity. If the organizers of the event can enable screen sharing so that I can start sharing my screen, I would appreciate that. But in the meantime, let's do an introduction because we're here to talk about sustainability and environmental, social, and governance. It's very important for new and old students to in the area of accounting and the accounting profession to, of course, always be updated with the latest trends in what's happening. And the topic of sustainability is very, very important and has been very, very important for the last couple of years. As we'll see in the content of this presentation, the fact that the IFRS Foundation, an organization that has for decades been involved in the creation of standards for financial information, is now working towards establishing a global baseline for sustainability information, just speaks about the importance of the topic of sustainability. So I hope that you can see my presentation right now, my screen right now. I'll show you the agenda for today, what we'll cover. First of all, we will talk a little bit about the context of why the IFRS Foundation is involved in sustainability and why we today, tonight, are talking about sustainability. As many of you probably know, the IFRS Foundation has, of course, created the International Sustainability Standards Board. These organizations that is going to be tasked with the creation of a global baseline for sustainability standards. Just like we have sustainability financial standards right now that are required and used by companies and investors around the world, the IFRS Foundation is trying to do the same with the context of sustainability and to create sustainability standards that are applicable around the world, just like we have financial standards. We will talk a little bit about the context of why the IFRS Foundation is dealing with, this whole sustainability agenda. And then in the next few portions of the presentation, we will talk about two of the exposure drafts, two of the first attempts of the IFRS Foundation to create a global baseline for sustainability standards. First, we will talk about exposure drafts IFRS S1, which is a document, an exposure drafts, a proposal for general requirements on how companies should report their sustainability information. And then we will talk about exposure draft S2, which is the second document that the IFRS Foundation has created, and that is focused only on the climate change disclosures. Climate change, of course, is one of the topics in sustainability that is, of course, the most important in the agenda, because climate change is something that we need to tackle as a humanity very, very soon in order to avoid catastrophic consequences. So it is very important in the context of disclosure to have information that is reported similarly by companies throughout the world. And finally, the final part of the presentation is going to be just to talk to you a little bit about what are the next steps of the IFRS Foundation and what are the specific calls to action for companies, investors, students, professors, and everybody involved in this ecosystem that we can take to be prepared for a future where companies and investors use homogeneous sustainability information. So with that in mind, with the agenda in mind, we can start to talk a little bit about the context as to why the IFRS Foundation is now looking at establishing and creating sustainability disclosure standards. The first slide, of course, is a slide to talk a little bit about the IFRS Foundation. I am sure that all of you know what the IFRS Foundation is based on your profiles, but it's always important maybe to spend 1 or 2 minutes to refresh the memory of everybody as to what the IFRS Foundation is and what the IFRS Foundation does. The IFRS Foundation is a non-for-profit organization which is supported by the G20 economies and which has public interest at hand. The mission of the IFRS Foundation is to develop standards that bring transparency, accountability, and efficiency to the capital markets around the world. And this is done with the objective of creating globally accepted standards. As you will see, these globally accepted standards are now in the realm of financial standards as well as sustainability standards. And also, one very important characteristic of the IFRS Foundation is that it has a public mandate to create these types of standards. Why? Because one of the organizations or bodies that supervises the work of the IFRS Foundation is a monitoring board that is led by the International Organization of Securities Commissions, or IOSCO. IOSCO is this organization that has a lot of members of regulators of the capital markets across the world, including the CVM in Brazil. And these organizations, through this monitoring board, supervise the work of the IFRS Foundation. So therefore, the IFRS Foundation has a public mandate to create globally accepted standards that are applicable internationally. And in the case of the accounting standards of the IFRS Foundation, these standards are now required in 140 jurisdictions around the world. We hope with this new endeavor of the IFRS Foundation into the world of sustainability, that something similar can happen with sustainability standards. Accounting standards are nowadays, as I said, required in 140 jurisdictions worldwide. And of course, we hope to achieve the same with sustainability standards around the world. So to start, let's talk a little bit about the current sustainability reporting landscape, what we are seeing now. Right now, companies that report information about their sustainability performance do so on a voluntary basis. And of course, reporting on a voluntary basis has some drawbacks, including that application of disclosure requirements is incomplete, that the ecosystem, the sustainability reporting ecosystem has multiple standard setters trying to define what companies should and should not report. And of course, also, these standard setters are focused on satisfying the needs of multiple different audiences. Some of them will tend to satisfy the needs of investors. Some of them will tend to satisfy the needs of other stakeholders. So there's a lot of, again, incomplete application and incomplete information that is required for the capital markets to function properly. There's also another trend that we see today in the sustainability reporting landscape, and that is that mandatory disclosure, when there is mandatory disclosure, is very different from one jurisdiction to the next, because again, each jurisdiction requires different information to be disclosed by companies. So there's a lot of differences between the information that a company, say, in Brazil reports versus a company, say, in Mexico or in Japan or in the United States or in Europe. So again, the voluntary initiatives do create incomplete information, and the handful of jurisdictional initiatives that are mandatory in nature also have their own problems. So there is also, you know, when you have multiple standard setters trying to define what companies should report and should not report, what ends up being the case is that there are multiple requirements from multiple organizations that are costly and complex for reporting for companies. There's also multiple and voluntary standards, like I said before, that makes comparing one company to the next very difficult and limits transparency. And of course, as I said also in the last slide, the different requirements by different jurisdictions also limit the global consistency and comparability of the information that companies are presenting in terms of sustainability. All of this means that right now we find ourselves in a world where there's diminished confidence and trust in the information that companies are presenting and are reporting in terms of their sustainability performance, because again, there's no global standard setter that defines what a company should report and should not report, like we have in the world of financial disclosure. So all these contexts led the IFRS Foundation last year to ask the market if the IFRS Foundation should be involved in the development of sustainability standards on a global basis. And the overwhelming feedback that the IFRS Foundation received during last year was that, yes, the IFRS Foundation needed to take sustainability into consideration and become the global standard setter, just like it has done for financial information. And that whole process ended up in COP26 with a few announcements that the IFRS Foundation made. COP26 was the climate change conference, the annual climate change conference sponsored by the United Nations. And it took place last year in Glasgow in the United Kingdom. And during COP26 last year, the IFRS Foundation made three very important announcements. The first announcement was the creation of the International Sustainability Standards Board, or ISSB for its English acronym. The second announcement that was made was that the IFRS Foundation would be diving into the world of sustainability, but it would not be diving into the world of sustainability alone, because it would consolidate with other organizations that have been working in the sustainability ecosystem for a while. And these organizations are the Climate Disclosure Standards Board and the Value Reporting Foundation. Some of you may know certain elements or certain tools already used by companies to report sustainability standards. And the Value Reporting Foundation, which is this organization which the IFRS Foundation has merged, was house of the Integrated Reporting Framework and the SASB standards. And the third big announcement that was made during COP26 last year was the publication of two prototypes that are today the precursors of the exposure drafts that the IFRS Foundation has created. So these three announcements that you see here on this slide are very useful in the next couple of slides because they will serve as a structure for us to structure our conversation. First of all, I want to show you this graphic, which is one of my favorite graphics because visually it explains very neatly what the IFRS Foundation is trying to do when they decided to create the International Sustainability Standards Board. You can think of the IFRS Foundation as having basically two hands which it develops globally applicable standards. In one hand is the IASB, the International Accounting Standards Board, which is tasked with developing IFRS accounting standards. And these IFRS accounting standards normalize or standardize the information that is included in financial statements. On the other hand, what was announced during COP26 was the creation of the ISSB, the International Sustainability Standards Board, which will have the objective of developing the IFRS sustainability disclosure standards that will dictate and will standardize the information that is included in of sustainability disclosures. And you can see those dotted lines here in this slide here, because the objective is for the market and investors in particular to have complete information about all the different risks and opportunities that a company faces when it starts its business model and it operates its business model. So investors need to understand, in one hand, the financial risks and opportunities that a company faces, but in the other hand, the sustainability risks and opportunities that the same company faces when it starts operating. And of course, the IFRS accounting standards and the IFRS sustainability disclosure standards intend to have this standardized information that will allow investors to have this complete and comparable information. So the International Sustainability Standards Board, or ISSB, has 4 main characteristics. The first one is that its objective is to develop a global baseline of sustainability disclosure standards. So basically a starting point that companies can use to talk about sustainability and investors can use to get information about sustainability. The work of the ISSB will focus on meeting the informational needs of investors and investors only, because again, with the work of the IASB, the IFRS Foundation has always been involved in satisfying the needs of investors. So now that the IFRS Foundation is getting itself into the world of sustainability, nothing has changed, because the focus of the work of the ISSB will also be to meet the informational needs of investors. Now, one of the very interesting announcements that were made during COP26 is that the work of the ISSB will not start from zero. The IFRS Foundation will not start from scratch to create sustainability standards, because it will build on existing frameworks and standards that companies and investors use today to disclose information on a voluntary basis. And we will talk about what standards and what frameworks are going to be used in the work of the ISSB in the next few slides. And then the last characteristics of the ISSB is that the work of the ISSB will facilitate the modularity with requirements that are country specific and that are aimed at broader groups of stakeholders. Normally, accountants have a very unique and a specific audience that they want to speak to, right? Accountants speak to investors, but with sustainability, it's a very different conversation, because sustainability information is very different in a way from financial information. There are many different stakeholders and very different audiences that may want information on the performance of companies in terms of sustainability. And those audiences may include investors, but they also may include other stakeholders like the employees of a company, the supply chain of a company, the clients of a company. So what the ISSB is trying to do is exactly that, to facilitate the modularity with these other stakeholders that have an appetite for sustainability information by creating a global base, a starting point from which companies can start to talk about sustainability information. Now, the IFRS Foundation, through the ISSB, right now has two proposed documents and exposure drafts that are the first tools, really, to talk about sustainability information in the context of globally accepted standards. The first exposure draft is a general requirements exposure draft, and it is known officially as IFRS S1. And the second document, which is known as IFRS S2, is a document that focuses only on climate-related disclosures. So it really focuses on the disclosure requirements for climate change only. And as you can see from that image under number 2, that exposure draft is accompanied by different annexes that are industry-based annexes and do signal what are the different climate-related disclosure topics that are important in the context of each industry. In the next few slides, we will talk about the general requirements exposure draft, as well as the climate-related exposure drafts, so that you can have an understanding of where the direction of travel is going with the work of the IFRS Foundation. But first, let me show you a slide that shows the proposed architecture that the IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Standards are proposing. What you see here in this slide on the left-hand side is 4 concentric circles. And these are the 4 core elements of the proposed architecture of the IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Standards. These standards are proposing companies to talk about 4 things in particular. First of all, to talk about governance. You know, the different structures and the different processes that they have in place as a corporate governance to deal with sustainability risks and opportunities. On a second level, the idea is to talk about strategy. And then also the third level is to talk about how risk and opportunities are managed and administered. And finally, the fourth concentric circle deals with metrics and objectives. And I apologize that I am just realizing there that they are in Spanish, actually. But the idea here is that there are 4 main pillars in the architecture of the IFRS sustainability standards. And these are governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and objectives. Also, part of the architecture of the proposed IFRS sustainability disclosure standards is to have 3 different types of requirements. And these you can see on the right-hand side of the slide. First of all, we'll have what we call general requirements. And general requirements, as the name suggests, are requirements that apply to any given company independent of its business model or operating industry. There's also thematic requirements, and these, as the name suggests, are requirements that have to deal with a specific theme, a specific sustainability topic. So you can think of climate change, for example, as being one topic for which requirements will be developed. But there will be others, not only climate change, because we know that the ESG agenda is more broader than climate change. There might be requirements for water. There might be requirements for biodiversity. There might be requirements for human capital, et cetera, et cetera. And then there will also be industry-based requirements, which again what these do is that they serve as the sustainability risks and opportunities that are important only in the context of specific industries and specific sectors. Now, what I'll do is overlay different logos of different organizations that have been working in the ecosystem of sustainability disclosure here. And you will see, start to see, I hope, how the ISSB and the IFRS Foundation is going to build on the work of existing frameworks and standards. For those of you that know the TCFD recommendations, the 4 concentric circles are taken precisely from the TCFD recommendations. And from those of you that don't know what the TCFD means, the TCFD is basically a project that for the last decade or so has created a framework for companies to report information about climate-related risks. So the IFRS Foundation will take these 4 core concentric circles and core elements and use those elements as part of its proposed architecture. Also, for those of you that know a little bit about sustainability, you probably have heard about the SASB standards. And the SASB standards are industry-based standards. And the IFRS Foundation, through its consolidation with the Value Reporting Foundation, will use the concepts of the SASB standards to feed and inform its industry-based requirements. And similarly, with the CDSB, the other organization with which the IFRS Foundation merged, the principles and concepts contained in the work of the CDSB will be used to inform the thematic requirements that the IFRS Foundation will develop in the future. And this is very important because one of the challenges that companies were facing in reporting sustainability information is that there were many organizations trying to define what was important for companies to report. So with the IFRS Foundation and the work of the ISSB, these principles, concepts, and indicators start to live under the same house, under the same roof, and be managed by one single organization. Now, when we talk about modularity, this concept is very important in the context of sustainability, because as I was saying a few minutes back, the nature of sustainability information and the nature of financial information is very different. Sustainability information has many different users apart from investors. So in a way, you can think of the information that companies report in a very simplistic manner, that there are 3 types of information that companies report. And those 3 types of informations are displayed on that graphic that you see here on this slide. First of all, we have financial information, and this is all the information that we already know that is reflected in financial accounts and financial statements, right? This is what accountants do. They are trained to report and understand financial information, and this is just one component of all the information that a company may report. There's also another world of information, which is sustainability information, and it is this red square here. And this is information that helps us understand how an organization impacts the economy, the environment, and society. But there is also an in-between world between sustainability information and financial information. And we call that world sustainability-related financial information. And what this means is information focused on the subset of ESG issues that are key to understanding how a company creates value or destroys value even. So what I'm going to do now next is overlay the logo of the IFRS Foundation and its 2 boards. On one hand, the IASB, and on the other hand, the ISSB. So what you see, and I hope becomes apparent is that with the creation of the ISSB, the IFRS Foundation is basically covering the first two types of information, financial information and sustainability-related financial information. Now, as I said, the IFRS Foundation is not doing this thing alone, and it's relying on the work of existing frameworks and standards. And I'm going to overlay the logos of two of the most important frameworks and standards in the world of sustainability reporting. The Integrated Reporting Framework is a framework that connects sustainability information with financial information. And the IFRS Foundation is actually going to use the principles and concepts behind the Integrated Reporting Framework to connect the work of its ISSB and ISSB councils. Also, as we saw before, the IFRS Foundation is going to use the content of the SASB standards to inform the basis of its industry-based requirements. And for those of you that know a little bit about sustainability, you might have heard about the GRI, which is another standard setter that for decades has created sustainability standards for companies to report sustainability information. So with this whole ecosystem that is being created, there is room also for the GRI reporting standards. And this room is actually placed in the red square that you see here in this diagram, where the information that is created through the GRI standards will help companies report information on their impacts on the economy, the environment, and society. Let's talk a little bit about exposure drafts S1, which is the general requirements exposure drafts. As I said before, the IFRS Foundation and the ISSB currently has two exposure drafts that we are working on to create this global baseline of sustainability standards. And in the next few slides, we will dive into the content and the purpose of IFRS S1, which is the exposure draft on the general requirements. So the main focus of this document is that it is proposing that companies report information that is material for investors on all the significant sustainability-related risks and opportunities that are useful to assess an enterprise value. For those of you that know IFRS accounting standards, what the general requirements exposure draft does is be basically an equivalent to IAS 1 and IAS 8. These are specific standards, of course, for the financial world. And the general requirements exposure drafts is basically the same, but for the sustainability reporting landscape. As I said, the main components of the IFRS S1 exposure draft are these four elements: governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. And these four elements are based on the TCFD recommendations. Again, this idea that the IFRS Foundation is not starting from zero, but on the contrary, it's basing its work on existing standards and frameworks. So the idea here is to give you a little bit of information of what these four pillars mean. In terms of governance, what the IFRS S1 exposure draft is trying to accomplish is to have companies report information that helps users of that information to understand what are all the governance processes, controls, and procedures that a company uses to monitor its sustainability-related risks and opportunities. In terms of a strategy, what the IFRS S1 exposure draft is seeking is to create information that helps users of sustainability information to understand what a reporting entity's strategy is when it faces sustainability risk and opportunities, and at what different points in time this strategy changes, because it's not the same to have a sustainability strategy in the short, medium, or long term. So with this requirement of requiring information on a strategy, the IFRS S1 exposure draft is trying to give us an idea of what is the short, medium, and long-term vision of companies when they're dealing with sustainability risks and opportunities. The third pillar is the pillar of risk management. And what this pillar is trying to convey is basically information that helps users of the information understand the different processes through which a reporting entity identifies, assesses, and manages both sustainability risks, but also sustainability opportunities. And finally, it is very important in the context of accounting and in the context of disclosure, not only to have qualitative disclosure, but also to have quantitative numbers, so metrics and targets. And this is the fourth and last pillar of the core elements of the first exposure draft. And what this pillar tries to create, it's information that helps investors and users of this information understand how a company is measuring, monitoring, or managing the different sustainability-related risks and opportunities that it has identified for itself, and not only how it measures, monitor, and manages these metrics and targets, but also how it is performing against specific targets that a company might have established for itself. And again, for those of you that know a little bit about sustainability, this language from these four core elements should not be something new. If you know the TCFD recommendations, this is language taken from the TCFD recommendations that has just been repurposed for the context of the work of the ISSB to simplify the ESG reporting ecosystem. Now, a few more key characteristics and key features of IFRS S1 exposure draft. First of all, if you were to download and read S1 exposure draft, you will see that there is a lot of emphasis on having sustainability information be connected with financial information. So there's a lot of emphasis on the interconnectivity of information. Why? Because it's important for investors to have a full picture, again, of all the risks, financial and non-financial, that a company faces when it operates. Part of that interconnectivity has to do with the timing of disclosure. Right now, what companies do is basically provide financial reporting during 1 month of the year. And then after a few months, they also provide sustainability information. But from the perspective of the investor, this is inefficient because investors need to have a full picture, a whole understanding of the risks and opportunities of a given company. So what the IFRS S1 exposure draft is proposing is that the timing of disclosure of sustainability information and financial information is actually at the same time. So the proposal here is for financial statements and sustainability reports to be published at the same time so that investors can have information at the same time and understand from a holistic manner all the risks and opportunities that a company faces. And another very important characteristic from this exposure draft, this general requirement exposure draft, is the location of disclosure. Normally, the IFRS Foundation, through its IASB standards, would be very explicit on where information should live in financial statements. However, for sustainability disclosure, the IFRS Foundation through the ISSB is taking a different approach, and it's not being prescriptive on where specifically this information should live, and it's leaving that decision to each jurisdiction. So the next portion of the presentation will focus on exposure draft S2. And this is the exposure draft that relates only to climate-related disclosures. S1, as I said, over the last few minutes, talks about sustainability in general. And what S2 does is to focus only on climate change-specific disclosures. So back to the architecture idea, this is a thematic exposure draft because it focuses only on climate-related disclosures. So the main objective of this document, of this proposal, of this exposure draft, is to require companies to disclose material information about all the significant climate-related risks and opportunities that they face. And this includes reporting about the physical risks that they face when the climate changes, transitional risk, which is another type of risk that has to deal with regulations and changes in consumer behaviors, et cetera, and not only about the risk portion of the conversation, but also about opportunities. Depending on the industry that a company participates in, there will be a different mix of risk and opportunities. And this is evident from an example that I'll give you just now. You can think of companies in the transportation sector. There's a lot of opportunities related to climate change in the transportation sector, because in order for us as a planet, as humanity, to tackle climate change, we will need to change our means of transportation. So companies participating in this sector will have a lot of opportunities to create new business models, new products and services. And of course, part of the conversation that the S2 is trying to create is for companies to talk about not only the risks that they face, but also the opportunities that they face when faced with climate-related risks and opportunities. And just like the exposure draft S1, this exposure draft S2 also incorporates the recommendations of the TCFD and the recommendations from other standard setters like the SASB standards. And this is exactly what I'm showing here in the next slide. So back to this idea that the IFRS Foundation is trying to simplify the ESG reporting landscape, you can very clearly see here with this illustration how it is actually achieving this simplification. Right now, or last year, companies would need to use TCFD recommendations and SASB standards. But now the principles and concepts of the TCFD recommendations, as well as the indicators from the SASB standards, live in one document. So going from two documents, voluntary documents, to one document that may be regulated in certain jurisdictions, simplifies the requirements by companies and makes disclosure more transparent and more cost-effective. S2 basically incorporates the recommendations of the TCFD, which again are governance, strategy, risk management, as well as metrics and targets. And it also incorporates the industry-specific requirements from the SASB standards that have to deal with climate change. Finally, in the last slide in this section, a few key characteristics of the IFRS S2 exposure draft. I'll start from the bottom up, because one key characteristic of the S2 exposure draft is that it is asking companies to report information on a scope 1 2, and 3 emissions. Maybe many of you being from the accounting profession don't really know what this means, scope 1, scope 2, or scope 3. But this is a very common metric used in the sustainability world to account for greenhouse gases. These gases, of course, that contribute to climate change. And what the IFRS S2 exposure draft is proposing is that companies do report scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions if these are material to understanding their enterprise value. Another key characteristics of this exposure draft is that it is proposing companies to disclose information on how their business strategies will change under multiple scenarios of different climatic conditions. This is very also common in the world of sustainability. How will your strategy change if, for example, temperatures rise from 0 to 1 degree Celsius, or how will your strategy change if temperatures change to 2 degrees Celsius? All this information is very important for investors to understand, and S2 is proposing companies to report this kind of information. And then lastly, another key component of S2, the exposure draft, is to require disclosure on what are the targets that companies have determined for themselves in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, and how they are using different mechanisms like carbon offsetting schemes to reach those targets. So basically to tell their own story about how they are managing climate-related risks and opportunities. Now, one more section that talks about the next steps of the ISSB and the IFRS Foundation. What can you expect as students of the accounting profession in terms of announcements from the ISSB and the IFRS Foundation in the next couple of months? So what you see here is basically a timeline. The exposure drafts that we have just gone through in detail were released at the end of March this year. And during April, June, and July, these exposure drafts were open for public consultation, where the IFRS Foundation received feedback on the content of these documents. That consultation period ended just a few weeks ago on July 29th. So the plan moving forward from August to December is to analyze all the feedback that we received on all these proposals, on all these components of these exposure drafts, and make changes when needed. It is very important for the IFRS Foundation, of course, to listen to the market, to listen to companies that are going to use these standards, to listen to investors that are going to use the information produced through these standards. And of course, we have received a lot of feedback. We received over 1,000 comment letters in the consultation period. So through August to December, we are going to go through all of these letters to see what the market thinks about the proposed exposure drafts. And the idea is that by the end of this year or early next year, to have the first 2 official IFRS sustainability disclosure standards that will accompany, of course, the IFRS accounting standards. Again, of course, all of this depends on how long it takes us as the IFRS Foundation to go through all the feedback that we received. But that's the idea, that by the end of the year or early next year, we will have the first 2 official IFRS sustainability disclosure standards. There are other priorities that go beyond the exposure drafts that we have detailed in the last couple of minutes. And I will briefly tell you what those other priorities are. First of all, the IFRS Foundation is working on a digital taxonomy. So basically what this means is to use digital technologies to tag information that companies are reporting so that processing that information is made easier. So the IFRS Foundation is already working on a digital tool, on a digital taxonomy that will allow for this processing of information on a more efficient way. There's also a priority to improve the SASB standards. Again, for those of you that know a little bit about sustainability reporting, you will know that the SASB standards are a very important tool that is used nowadays by more than 1,000 companies around the world. But there are some limitations to the SASB standards, and mainly those limitations are that some of its industry-specific standards are very US-centric, are very biased towards concepts in the United States. So what the IFRS Foundation and the ISSB will do in the next couple of months is to improve the international applicability of those standards so that they can be used on a global basis and as a global baseline. And finally, the other big priority is, of course, to define the future agenda of the ISSB. Right now, what we have is a general requirements exposure draft and a climate-related exposure draft. But of course, sustainability is more broad than climate change, and we need to define as the IFRS Foundation what that agenda is going to be. What other themes and topics on the sustainability side we need to focus on and create similar documents. As I said before, it may be water, it may be biodiversity, it may be human capital. That will depend on how a public consultation on our future agenda goes. And finally, for companies, for professionals of the accounting and sustainability world, for investors, there's a very clear call to action that the IFRS Foundation is trying to push. Basically, the main message here from the IFRS Foundation is, of course, to get to know the exposure drafts, to download the exposure drafts and read them so that you understand what are the proposed requirements contained in these documents. But for companies and investors in particular, the recommendation and the call to action is to start using or continue to use the different frameworks and standards that these documents rely upon. And that, again, are the TCFD recommendations, the integrated reporting framework, and the SASB standards. Why? Because by using these existing frameworks and standards, professionals in the accounting world, in the sustainability world, will be, of course, better prepared to implement the IFRS sustainability disclosure standards when they are officialized in the future. Another very important call to action is to continue engaging with the IFRS Foundation in future consultations. There will be future instances where the IFRS Foundation will ask the market, will ask accountants, will ask investors, companies, preparers, etc., to comment on proposals. So it's important to always participate in these consultations and make your voice heard. And finally, the last recommendation is to keep yourselves informed by signing up to alerts. And you can see there a particular link where you can subscribe to our newsletter to always be up to date about the work of the IFRS Foundation and the ISSB. So with that, I'll stop my presentation. I hope that this information was useful for you as you think of how the sustainability world and the accounting world are starting to merge together. It is work that the IFRS Foundation is also learning to do through the collaboration with others, with other existing frameworks and standards. So it's a time, really a very interesting time for students of accounting, for students of sustainability, because what the world needs is a global solution to sustainability information, so that all companies across the world do produce the same information and do use the same standards internationally, and that can help the capital markets have standardized information. And we hope that you are part of the journey, and we hope that you download the documents to start learning about the work of the IFRS Foundation and the ISSB in particular. So again, thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you, and we'll open up for questions and answers.
Nós temos algumas dúvidas para serem esclarecidas no chat. Como estamos? Bom, ao que me consta aqui tudo certinho, eu gostaria de agradecer, então, o Arturo, que esteve conosco nessa noite tão importante, tão especial. Muitíssimo obrigado. Agradecer também a nossa tradutora, que esteve conosco durante todo o tempo, desempenhando um lindo trabalho. Muitíssimo obrigado. Daremos início agora, neste momento, ao Prêmio de Excelência Acadêmica da FIPECAF. O prêmio foi instituído pela Faculdade FIPECAF visando reconhecer o desempenho dos seus docentes e discentes. Apresentaremos agora os alunos e docentes que se destacaram no primeiro semestre deste ano. Confiram.
Que dia que era essa viagem? Então, não pode ser durante a semana.
Parabéns, parabéns a todos os premiados, todos os docentes e discentes aqui da nossa instituição neste semestre. Muitíssimo obrigado. A gente espera que no próximo semestre possamos ver o nome de cada um de vocês aqui premiados nesse momento tão especial. Eu quero desde já agradecer a todos que estiveram conosco, agradecer o Arturo, agradecer a nossa mesa de diretoria por essa noite tão especial. E a Faculdade FIPECAF segue com vocês, por vocês, Estamos aqui sempre à disposição para esclarecerem todas as dúvidas. Sejam muito bem-vindos os alunos de graduação, pós-graduação, MBA, mestrado. Muito, muito bem-vindos. Vamos fazer desse semestre 2 de 2022 um semestre de muito sucesso. Chegamos ao final de mais uma aula magna e eu agradeço a presença de todos em nome da Faculdade FIPECAF. Desejo um excelente não só semestre, mas também um longo período de ensino aqui conosco. A todos, muito obrigado e uma boa noite.